I was the first gymnast that actually wrote about what it was really like. We were sent around the world. The national team coach was a rapist.
How could they not have been supportive of you speaking against rape and abuse of young girls?
I was astonished. We came up with the brand name XXXY Athletics, and we were off to the races.
Now you're waking a lot of people up when it comes to this issue of transgender ideology and women's sports.
Sports do not exist to validate your identity.
Not only is there an industry behind this, but now the government is getting behind this.
What's wrong with you if you're not willing to stand up for children?
Jen, hello, friend.
Nice to be here again. Good to see you.
It was so surreal when we became friends during the lockdowns. And it was right after you spoke out while living in San Francisco, working for Levi's, speaking on behalf of our children. And you had that incredible bravery and foresight where, like some other mama bears around the country, decided to put kids first, even before your career. And I've been following your career and everything that you've been doing, and your disagreeable personality has led to so much good. And I just can't wait for people to hear what you've been doing now and just your story. And so welcome back to PragerU.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. A lot has happened since last time I was here, so I'm excited to share.
A lot has happened. Let's start with just the beginning, because you were born and raised into an environment where you had to be incredibly obedient, and you are no longer that type of person. And I think that your upbringing probably gave you this incredible conviction. And so for those who don't know your story, can we just hear a little bit about your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up on the East Coast in Philadelphia and New Jersey, and I started gymnastics around 1974. 1975, just a couple years after Title IX. I was a very busy, active child. And despite the fact that Title IX had just passed in 1972, there weren't that many opportunities for girls who were very athletic. Gymnastics was definitely one. And then Nadia Comaneci in the Olympics in 1976 just lit me up. I just wanted to be just like her. She was 14 years old. She was a child. There's not that many sports where you could see somebody that you related to in that way. And I very quickly got very serious. You know, I was training 30 hours a week when I was like 8 or 9. I made my first national team when I was 10. And I loved it. And I just pushed my parents. I wanted to go to the next gym, better gym, wanted to get better and better and better. And by the time I was 14, I moved away from home.
So you actually wanted to work out that hard. It wasn't that your parents had this dream for you and they pushed you. You wanted it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I often have, looked back and I think about how difficult I must have been to parent. I feel bad for my parents because they just wanted to support me. I was so driven. And I was driven to the point where it wasn't good for me. But my parents wanted to support me because I wanted this thing so bad. And I loved the sport until I didn't. So when I was 14, I went to my third club. And this was one of the gymnastics clubs that was the best in the country at the time. There were about 3 outstanding clubs that had the national team members, coming out of those clubs. And this was one of them. And I went and I lived away from home, but close enough so that I could visit my family on the weekends. And it was brutal. It just, and I was fine at first. I sort of felt like I made this deal with the coaches. Like, if I do everything you ask of me, you'll give me back what I want. I was already a national team member, but I wanted to be in the top 6, and I was like in the top 10 or 12. That wasn't good enough for me. And it was fine at first, but it wears on you over time. And the abuse becomes more just aggressive over time. When I talk about the emotional and physical abuse in the sport that I endured, I trained on a broken ankle for 2 years. We were weighed in several times a day. Our weight was announced on the loudspeaker. I don't coach fat gymnasts. After a 5-6 hour training session, an hour and a half more of conditioning in a plastic sweatsuit to lose a pound by the next day if you gained a half a pound. I mean, I was 15 and I had 2% body fat. I didn't menstruate till I was 19. I mean, I could go on and on. The emotional and physical abuse was intense. And again, at first I could endure it, but I did begin to unravel as I got a little older. I won nationals in 1986, and it was literally from that moment forward that I I came apart at the seams.
It is amazing how an adolescent can be so easily manipulated and pushed by the culture around. And so you endured all of that probably because that was the culture around you, right? And the culture around you was that it was acceptable to mentally and physically abuse little girls for the sake of the sport. It was made acceptable at that time to do those things. And I know that later on you became an advocate for young girls, and some of the laws have changed, and you made that movie.
Yeah.
But people underestimate what young kids will do to themselves, including adolescents, when the culture puts that kind of pressure.
And not just the girls. I mean, and I always say little girls are pleasers. Can you imagine, a person, 13-year-old girl, she wants to, for the most part, there are exceptions, my daughter being one of them, they want to please the adults around them. I think most children do. And that was me. And if a therapist later in life explained it to me, if a parent abuses a child, they say it's the child's fault. If you weren't bad, I wouldn't have to hit you. That's the dynamic in the sport. If you weren't fat, I wouldn't have to punish you for being fat. I wouldn't have to take food off your plate. If you weren't lazy, I wouldn't have to force you to train. You would just do it. And so you internalize those things about yourself, and you believe that you are, in fact, the problem. It's not just the girls that accept it. The parents accept it. The national federation that governs the sport accepts it. It's tough coaching. It's not abuse, it's tough coaching. And I was 20 years out of the sport and nearly 40 years old, and I continued to suffer anxiety, terrible nightmares about the sport. I mean, I was like a grown, normal person. I had like a really good job. I had 2 children, and I had terrible nightmares about the sport. And that's why I sat down and wrote my first book. And I think I just did it to make sense of what had happened and why I still felt this way as an accomplished 40-year-old woman. And I came to understand and realize that this was, in fact, abuse. Not only was there emotional and physical abuse, but we were surrounded by sexual abusers as well, which I was fortunate enough to evade because, we were sent around the world. The national team coach was a rapist. I wrote about it in the book. Nobody ever had spoken of it, but we all knew, and we were told to avoid him. Don't be in a room alone with him. This is what we were told by our own club coaches. Not, we need to turn this guy in, but you should just avoid him. But he's a good and respected coach, so, be respectful. So, I wrote the book, and I don't think I knew what I was getting into at the time. It came out in 2008 called Chalked Up, and I was the first gymnast that actually wrote about what it was really like. And this was before Me Too. It was not okay to say these things about respected men. And everyone in the sport, my teammates, my national teammates, USA Gymnastics, the USOC, they all came for me. And it was my first experience with being dragged across the internet. And I did not expect that.
How could they not have been supportive of you speaking against rape and abuse of young girls? It's just really shocking.
It is really shocking, isn't it? I was astonished. People would call, this is 2008, like you went on radio shows and people called in. And teammates would call in when I was on the radio and call me a liar, say they were going to sue me. I had readings scheduled that the publisher canceled. They were afraid there would be violence. I think for young gymnasts, your identity, and not even young, grown, is so wrapped up in the sport, and you want the validation. Many of these girls, women, they still crave the validation of their coaches. And so anyone that sort of threatens that and pierces the bubble of this cult, because that's what it is, they come for you.
Well, and also there's incredible shame, I would imagine, when you are speaking out against something that others should have spoken out against too, right? And so suddenly you're speaking out against it. What does it say about them when they are not speaking out as well?
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought of it that way. The way I thought of it was, for a lot of people, they want to remember this as sort of the prime of their life. They want to remember it in this incredibly positive way. For a lot of people, it's the highest attainment that they've achieved. They won medals. They were on the national team. And so to really contend with the reality of it, it's a long recovery, and they don't want to. They'd rather live in this kind of like false story about their childhood. One of the women I remember who was on my team with me, she said, "Why is that what you talk about? You know, they were nice too. They hugged us if we won." And I said, "Yeah, but that was 1% of the time. They tore you down the rest of it." That's like saying, after your husband hits you, "Well, he loves me. He told me he loved me after." He's still an abuser. So people want to kind of protect the memory of what it was like in this really strange way. But it's interesting because I wrote the book, and then as you referenced, I made a movie 12 years later called Athlete A, and it pulled back the curtain for a lot of women who'd competed in the sport and continued to suffer. And I got hundreds of emails saying, "I had no idea why I still suffered. I was abused. And now I understand it and I have the language to describe it."
So when Athlete A came out, at that point, I think the movie was quite popular and
Yeah.
people really were on your side. They saw what you experienced.
Yeah.
And so how did those who didn't say anything 10, 15 years prior then react?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, it was 2 years after Larry Nassar went to prison. So, or was convicted, I should say. I mean, the doors were blown off the whole story because at that point, USA Gymnastics tried to make it that it was just this one bad apple, but it exposed everything. He abused for 30 years, over 500 athletes he sexually assaulted. You can't do that in secret. The Federation knew, and they covered up for him, and that was all part of the story. So it really, what the film revealed was that there was this culture of abuse that was accepted. And at that point, everybody said, "We stood with you. You were right. Yes, this is true. We've always stood with you." And I thought to myself, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. There is one person who called me and apologized. She's a good woman, good friend. She said, "I was wrong." She told me she had been sexually abused by one of her coaches, our coaches, and she wasn't ready to deal with it. And so she came after me, and she was wrong. And she apologized. And she said I was right about everything, and she would stand with me and fight now. I think I get choked up thinking about it. That's hard to do, to admit that you were wrong. And I think it's important to reveal that sort of introspection and to say, here's why I was wrong, and here's why I did it, and here's why I came for you. Because I think that it encourages that sort of introspection in others.
I think the reason I have such a strong emotional response to your story, aside from the fact that I am also a mom and I have little girls that are in gymnastics, I feel like so many of us experienced something somewhat similar with the lockdowns and COVID, right? They locked our kids up. Many of them knew that it was a wrong thing to do. They towed the line. They knew it was wrong. The experts knew about it. They called us liars. They made us live in a lie. And then now that everything is revealed and we know the truth, people are pretending that they didn't try to shame us and tell on us and lock us up and do all these terrible things. Especially to you. I mean, you lived this entire experience twice. The experience that you had as a child, you relived again when you were at Levi's.
Yeah, and I tell people ask me all the time, why was this the hill you were willing to die on during COVID? And I say, you mean protecting children and standing up for free speech? Why weren't you? What's wrong with you if you're not willing to stand up for children? I mean, honestly, children are the most vulnerable among us. They don't have a voice, they don't vote, and by and large, they will try to please the adults around them. And so I think that for me, that's my line. I wish someone had stood up for me when I was a kid in the sport and the doctor was coming to the gym every 6 weeks to shoot me up with cortisone without parental consent. And so, from March 13th, the day the schools closed in San Francisco, my husband and I were very, very vocal, March 13th, 2020. And the difference about standing up during COVID and standing up in gymnastics is the whole world went mad during COVID. Within my sport, when I stood up, it was only the people in the sport that came for me. The rest of the world, honestly, embraced the message. And it was like a light was shined on the sport. And they went, that's that's not okay. But in the sport, they were still trying to protect the image. With COVID, I mean, you know this, like we were in the vast minority. And if you lived in San Francisco, I mean, I swear it was me and my husband who were saying—
and your entire community was on the left, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I was a Democrat my whole life. Everybody I think 96% of San Franciscans are registered Democrats or something crazy like that. I mean, there's just no diversity of thought. And while I moved to the city in 1992 and loved the way I felt they embraced difference, it is now a city that is aggressively conformist. And it's not just that they all hold a single view, but they will come for you. I mean, we had the police called on us multiple times for being in the park and having a picnic with my family. I have 4 children. That's very unusual in San Francisco. People assumed we were more than one household. You weren't allowed in the park to mix households outside. We also, I'll admit, jumped the fence to go into playgrounds. People called the police on us. They were told that it was a good thing. It was morally righteous to call the cops on your neighbors. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
How did you have that ability, that discernment? Because your entire world was a believer in this ideology, right?
Yeah.
And so you were like, no, I'm going to jump the fence. I'm going to speak out. I mean, you're on you had a dream career, right? You had this incredible position at Levi's. You were chief marketing officer and then
brand president,
which is massive, probably on track to maybe become CEO. And you decide at the peak of your career to jump the fence and cause a lot of trouble with all your friends and everybody around you subscribing to this ideology. And you're like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm giving it all up. I'm giving it all up. I'm going to cause a lot of trouble. I'm going to take on the shame. I'm going to take on the onslaught. I mean, I want people to understand it's much easier to fight back when everybody around you is on your side. But to fight this alone? Almost alone?
Yeah. I didn't think about it. This is what I tell people all the time. Like, don't think about it too much.
You thought they were tolerant?
No, I was just thinking about the children. That was all I was thinking about. And, you know, it was very similar to what I did in standing up for the gymnast. I wrote that book by myself in a room. I didn't really think about what would happen when it came out. I wrote it because I needed to write it. And then it came out and the blowback came. And I guess I retreated very briefly. And then I was like, no. Like, if they're coming for me this way, it's bad. They're hiding even more. And I gathered my strength and my courage and I kept going. Now, in that instance, I had friends who had nothing to do with the sport who were very supportive, so that helped. During COVID, I had no friends that supported. But my husband and I were in line. We were lined up and supported each other. I don't know. I didn't really think about it. And then you start, and then I get told you can't say these things, whether it's by my neighbors or my friends or my brother. And that's when I really go, you can't tell me what I can say. You can't. No. And it became very clear very early that children were suffering and being harmed. And I think it doesn't matter to me what the consequences are if I know that is happening.
I think you woke a lot of people up when you published your story. I mean, you obviously have the book, and originally I read your article when it came out, and I think there are a lot of people who are maybe would call themselves now politically homeless or classical liberal, who are not quite sure where they stand, but they know that they're being lied to or forced to live in a lie. And now you're waking a lot of people up when it comes to this issue of transgender ideology and women's sports. That has been another behemoth that you have taken on. How did you make that leap from being, this freedom fighter for our kids' playgrounds and schools to now a person who's trying to correct quite a lot of evil in sports?
Well, the moment I realized that I was going to do something different and probably start my own business, I was interviewing after I resigned from Levi's. I was interviewing at big jobs, I mean, big brands. Recruiters called me and I would say, are you sure they're going to accept me? Because I had, given myself quite the reputation. And I was in this one interview. It was for a CEO job of an $8 billion retailer. And I went through 9 interviews, something like that. The last one was with an HR person that was on the board. And she started the interview with, "Are you willing to apologize for what you've done?" I'm not kidding you. This is in August 2023. And I was like, I actually was stunned that I'd gone through, 9 rounds and it never came up, that I was this like COVID dissenter. It didn't come up. They just asked me about my skills, product, market, all the things, financial discipline. And the HR person, of course, led with it. And I said, no, why would I apologize? I was right about everything. Not surprisingly, I did not get the job. And I realized I could never go back into an established company because my real crime when it comes to corporate America was not reading from a script.
Mm.
It's not the content. It's not, you pushed back during COVID. Because at this point, this is 2023, everybody knew closed schools. It was the consensus at this point that closed schools were harmful and ineffective. You are not allowed to stray from the script in corporate America. You read the words that are given to you. And I didn't do that. So that's when I sort of was like, okay, what am I going to do now? And I had this idea with a friend who now works for me and the company that I could combine my background as an athlete, an elite athlete, someone who'd stood up for female athletes, world-class fashion and apparel experience. I mean, Levi's is the best. I learned from the best. And my willingness to say true but inconvenient things. And I could start my own thing, which is a lot to take on in your 50s, not something I planned. But it was like this light bulb moment. And we came up with the brand name together, XXXY Athletics, and we were off to the races.
So what is your brand about? For those who haven't seen your brand yet, because it is brand new.
Yeah, it's only 5 months old. We're the only athletic brand to stand up for female athletes in women's sports, the protection of women's sports. I looked around at all the athletic brands out there, from Lululemon to Nike. They all pretend to stand up for women, and they're either silent on this issue of males entering women's sports or on the wrong side.
What is your expectation? Is the idea that moms and dads would go to the soccer field wearing this and get into trouble? I mean, is that kind of the idea? And is that the type of pushback that you might be getting?
It's a great question. The idea from the outset was to normalize standing up for women's sports. Right now, it's sort of taboo. Most people agree with us and the brand. 70%, according to the latest Gallup poll, of people agree with us. But when you're out there saying this and you know this, it doesn't feel like 70% of people agree with you. It feels like you're in the vast minority. But I find brands can normalize issues. A great brand with amazing product and amazing marketing can sort of normalize issues in the culture. And I hesitate to say on the right, because I don't necessarily consider myself on the right, we don't do this very well.
Those of us on the right side of things.
Oh, right. I mean, I feel like this issue of males and women's sports, which is just the sort of tip of the iceberg of the broader gender ideology. This is not a right versus left. This is a truth issue.
Right.
And biology exists. It is real. Men can't become women. It's not complicated. And yet we've lost our minds in the last 5 years or so. But brands, art, culture, music, film, it can normalize ideas in the culture. And the left is really good at this.
They are.
And they smuggle these ideas in via art and brands. And the right is left trying to deal with it at a policy or legislation level. Well, if it's gone that far, you've lost.
Well, and they also try to shame us, and we allow them to do so.
That's
and so
right.
I bring up the soccer field issue because parents will come up to me and say, "Oh, you're so brave that you're willing to stand up. We agree with you." As you said, we agree with you that a boy should not compete against a girl. We agree with you that it's a problem. But, we're just afraid, and we don't want to get the looks, and we don't want to make other people uncomfortable because, it's hurtful. And also my kids are around and I want to get into a dispute. And oftentimes my answer to them is, you know what I am afraid of, Jen? I'm afraid that in 20 years, I will look back and I will ask myself, when things have gotten worse because good people didn't stand
That's
up,
right.
I will ask myself whether I've done everything I could to stop it. That is what I'm afraid of. Not of a bad look or a bad comment from someone who is not even really a friend. I am so afraid that my grandkids will one day write a paper about me and say, my grandma was a coward, that she wasn't even willing to wear a T-shirt that said the truth. Yeah. That is what scares me.
No, I am with you. Look, I do want people to wear it to the soccer game on the weekend. I do it. And I will tell you, 99.9% of the time, moms come up and say exactly that. I agree with you. And I'm like, well, you need to stand up then.
Yeah, turn on the volume.
Now, exactly. It's not enough anymore to just agree. You need to stand up. We're literally standing up for actual truth. And I will not be bullied by people who spew nonsense language like trans women are women. They are not. They are trans women. They are male, period. And when we allow the language to be co-opted in this way, the lie lives on. If you concede on the language and you say, oh, yes, of course, trans women are women, then they must be left into women's sports and spaces. They're women. You can't give in on the language. So I had my first negative interaction recently, just a few days ago at soccer practice. My daughter was wearing the shirt that you're wearing. And somebody came up to me at the end of practice and said, that shirt is really harmful. Can you please have her not wear that anymore? And I said, I don't think it is harmful. I care about the protection of women's sports and spaces. But it's interesting. Here I am out here. I'm putting this brand out. I'm saying these things. I shrunk briefly. And I had to remind myself, do not shrink. And so, I was very nice. I was very polite. She said, we both agree that we need to protect girls. I just believe we need to protect all girls. And I was like, oh no, you're saying that you're the nice person because you're protecting the girls that are boys and I'm the bad person? This is not happening. And so I stood my ground, and she, the conversation ended with her saying, well, I just trust you'll have your daughter not wear that shirt anymore to practice. And I said, I understand your view. And I walked away. I made no such commitment. My husband and I agreed we were both going to wear the shirt and the hat to every game, and we were going to give them to the other parents that agreed with us. We should not be shamed. These people are wrong.
They are wrong, and their claim, ironically, is that they're the ethical and moral ones, which is the irony behind it is so mind-boggling because they're the ones who are forcing us to live in a lie, forcing our children to live in a lie. And when they're saying, oh, well, we're advocating for these children who want to be able to compete. Okay, so these men who are competing against women, you have, 700 and something men who identify as women who are robbing trophies and awards from young women. But it's not just the woman who didn't win the trophy. It's the hundreds of other women who had to compete against the 700 and something men. And so now you're talking about probably 10,000 women. Oh, yeah. 10,000 women who had to forfeit a potential victory because of a few hundred fringe males who either have gender dysphoria or simply are failing athletes who understand that if they compete against a woman, they have the leg up.
Yeah, the misogyny is staggering. It's dressed up in a different form, but basically girls and women are being told to sit down, be quiet, get hit in the boxing ring, get hit with the field hockey stick. You need to do that to be considered a nice and inclusive person. So sit down. Do not advocate for yourself. You're being a selfish bigot if you dare stand up for yourself. How is that different than women being told to sit down and shut up for eons? It's the same. It's just, dressed up in a different way, and I'm not going to do it. And the irony is, we did an ad to launch this brand that we call Stand Up. And it's an inspiring ad that's just saying to girls and women, stand up for yourself. If you think this is not okay, stand up. So there's a line in the ad. If you think it isn't fair or safe for males to compete in girls' sports, stand up. We're banned permanently from TikTok for that because it's hate speech. If you think it's not fair or safe, this is why I say you cannot give an inch on the language. TikTok offered, if you change that, I'm not changing anything. They say you can't say that because it's misgendering and it's hate speech. They eliminate your ability to even describe this issue accurately. I will not give in to the language police on this.
Well, when you speak and you say these words, just be quiet and conform and do it for the sport and do it for the culture. It just takes me back to the stories you told me about your childhood.
Yeah.
When you were there and the girls on your team got raped and molested, but they had to shut up because that is what the Olympics wanted them to do.
Right.
How is that not the same exact thing?
It is.
And where are these moms and dads? Where are they? I mean, what is the essence of parenting if it's not to protect your innocent children during this very short amount of time when you can actually protect them? Where are they? Like, how is wearing a T-shirt something too scary for a parent? I just can't get over it. I'm sorry I'm getting so upset about it, but it's crazy.
How is being called a name too scary? You're an adult. Who cares if you're called a name? Who cares? It's not true. You're not a bigot just because you stand up for your daughter. You're not a bigot. So ignore it. But it is so embedded in the culture, and it is so embedded in these sort of institutions,
right?
The universities, the New York Times, CNN, they'd all have us believe that if we think girls deserve an equal playing field, we are bigots. Well, I am sorry. Sports do not exist to validate your identity. That's not what sports are about. And I'm sorry if a male thinks he's female and wants to compete in women's sports to validate that identity. That is not what the sports are for. And the federations and the governing bodies, they have an obligation to the athletes to create a fair and equal playing field.
So, Jen, one of the things that I'm sure we will be able to read in the comments below is that you and I are exaggerating. Okay, yeah. This is not a big issue. It's a red herring issue. It's not really happening. Plenty of girls are out there competing fairly, and we are just taking this to another level. You're capitalizing off of it. I'm fear-mongering, and it's not, this trans issue amongst children is really fringe and not real.
Well, first of all, in sports, it's happening everywhere. It just happened at the Olympics. 2 biological males. Now, they're not trans. They have differences in sex development, DSDs. 2 biological males won gold medals in women's boxing. I never thought that was a sentence I would ever have to say. 2 men won gold medals in women's boxing at the Olympics. That's the highest stage in the world.
Can anybody be surprised, by the way, why it would be a male that would win against
shocking,
a woman? Like, right? Shocking, really. Yeah. But even in golf, right? Even in golf, men
it's happening in golf at the LPGA, at Q School, which is how golfers qualify for the LPGA. We have a male who was a golfer in his 20s of no repute, never won a single award or medal. He's now about to qualify for the LPGA. The highest competitive level in the United States in women's golf. Okay, so it's there. State track championships just this year in multiple states. Males won multiple events. The NCAA finals, Riley Gaines. I mean, it's like...
Riley Gaines is a partner of yours in this project,
She's
right?
one of our ambassadors, absolutely. And she's become the face of this movement because she's been brave enough to stand up and say, this isn't fair or right. And at the NCAA finals in 2022, she swam against... Will/Leah Thomas. He had swum as Will for 3 years on the University of Pennsylvania team. He was ranked in the mid-500s overnight. He says he's a woman, and he's ranked in the top 3 across major events and beating some of the best swimmers in the world, Olympic gold medalists. Like, there's no more surefire way to improve your ranking in a sport than to go from competing as a mediocre male to being a woman. If that's not enough to prove the advantage, it's the most significant athletic advantage is being male, more than steroids.
And this is becoming, not only is there an industry behind this, but now the government is getting behind this. And so you have 14 states that are considered sanctuary trans states, which means that if a child under the age of 18 wants to transition and get a top surgery, get on medication, get on hormones, all of those things, the parents don't even need to consent to that.
That's right. This is why sports is the tip of the iceberg around this. I realize it's not the whole issue, but I think It's a very public forum where this battle is being waged. The real issue is the lie that underpins males competing in women's sports, which is, if you say you're a woman, you are. It doesn't matter what your parts are. We can cut those off and put new ones on, and we can do it for children. And any parent that doesn't affirm that is an abuser, and we're going to take that child from you, parents, if you push back on this. And we are going to make that child a ward of the state. The lie is so egregious, and this is why I say it's not right or left. It's about truth. Men cannot become women. They cannot. And we should not be cutting the body parts off of healthy children. And I believe you have the numbers there. I mean, it's increased thousands and thousands of fold in just the last few years. There's a social contagion that is happening in liberal cities in particular, and children are being harmed. And so again, as I said before, if children are being harmed, I can't really sit idly by, and I don't really understand the adults that can.
Right. Well, the sport is the way to normalize this behavior.
Yeah.
As you say, it starts with the culture. And so by allowing Leah Thomas to annihilate Riley Gaines and saying that that is okay, then now it is okay in Minnesota to accept 30,000 young children who basically want to change their gender, who are told that their bodies are flawed and therefore they should get onto meds and surgeries and become pharmaceutical ATMs, right? They normalize it through the sports.
That's
They'll
right.
normalize it through the culture.
That's right.
And so if you don't stand for truth in those environments, then ultimately it's going to impact every single one of our homes. I think the numbers are that 1 out of 5 transgender people are actually children.
That's right.
Right? That is an astonishing number, because who is impacted most by culture? Who is most going to be impacted by what they're watching on social media, on TikTok, right? These are these young kids. And who is the best customer for these pharmaceuticals? The lifelong customers that start at age 6.
Yeah, and I see them preying upon young girls in particular. And I think it really exploded during COVID, frankly, because you had kids locked at home, not interacting with peers, online, perpetually online, depressed because they're isolated. And they found solace in some of these online forums. And, these ideas are planted there that if you are a depressed, uncomfortable young person who isn't, as an adolescent, sort of depressed and uncomfortable with your body.
I know I
was.
Well,
that means you're trans.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot of kind of cultural factors at play. I also think, in this era of white privilege, there's no more surefire way to go from being hated as someone who has all the privilege to having status because you're trans. And I'm sorry you can hate me for saying that, but that is just true.
It is true. It's that victim bingo mentality that we're teaching our kids where, if you're wealthy, if you're white, if you're successful, you should then harm your body and convince everybody that your body is flawed.
Yeah, and the whole sort of medical industrial complex is in on it. I mean, It's really astonishing. It shouldn't be astonishing to me. I should take that back. The American Academy of Pediatrics, if they are not there to protect our children,
they're not there for that.
They are not. And we saw it during COVID. They were changing their website in the dark of night to say, there's no studies on masking that say that harms children. No, you're right. There are no studies. That won't harm a child's language development. I mean, it's absurd on its face. And yet they recommended masking of 2-year-olds, the American. I mean, this is a joke organization.
Right. But there are several organizations that are coming out now. I know that there's a group of surgeons that have come out and said that the surgeries really can cause lifelong damage to these kids. And in Europe, of course, you're seeing that they're doing a complete U-turn on this, where America, sadly, is I don't know if the word is even behind on this, because what has happened in the United States is an industry has been developed around it. And so now there are all these financial ties to the transgender or gender affirming care and merchandise for it and clinics. I mean, I think here I have another number just that happens to be from Minnesota. 91 providers are established now in Minnesota. So you have this industry of trans care. And there's not a lot of an incentive to shut those industries down, right?
But let's be clear. This so-called gender-affirming care, this is puberty blockers for young people, which impacts bone development, brain development. You can't just pause puberty, a normal human activity is not the right word. Like, this is required for
human
humans
development
to become an adult. So we're talking about puberty blockers, quote unquote, cross-sex hormones, which means giving a young girl testosterone, a young boy female hormones like estrogen, and then, of course, surgeries. This is gender affirming care. It does everything but affirm a child. It tells a child they are born in the wrong body. How could you tell that to a child? How could you tell a child they're born wrong?
The number of people that are impacted by this incredibly evil social experiment that is happening right now is in the hundreds of thousands in the name of helping the very few who have this gender dysphoria, who probably just need a different type of help.
Or to go through puberty, which resolves it.
Right.
99.9% of the time. Or we wouldn't have even called it gender dysphoria back in the day. I mean, I didn't like going through puberty. I was old when I did it. I didn't like it. Your body is changing. It's very uncomfortable. Now you're told as a child, if you don't like that process and what child does, that's gender dysphoria.
Right.
You're told in the online forums, and then if you actually, speak to a doctor or a counselor or a therapist, they'll reinforce that same idea.
Well, because they have to.
I mean,
right?
I didn't like getting boobs. Who likes it? It's a very awkward, uncomfortable time and period. It's not just bad for sort of more masculine or tomboyish girls, but more feminine boys as well, who are also told you're a girl. I mean, it's very anti-gay in a sense. And there are people within the LGBT community who are saying, no, that's not. We would have been told we were girls or boys or vice versa as children, and we're just gay people. So I think it's anti-woman. I think it's misogynist. I think it is anti-gay.
It's anti-human.
It's anti-human. It really is. It's interesting because, I'm not a religious person. I am Jewish, but I would call myself a secular humanist. And I think I have a lot in common with people of faith on this issue, because I respect the sort of, I mean, I don't know what other word to use, the soul of a person. The body is more than material. You can't just cut off the parts like it's a Mr. Potato Head and replace them with other parts. I mean, it's so grotesque. We're going to look back at this time in the way we look at lobotomies and recovered memory as these huge medical scandals. And I agree with you. I will not allow myself to be on the wrong side of that. And unfortunately, I think it changes when so many children are harmed. And I think that's what started to happen in Europe, in the UK, where they've closed the major gender clinic. They started to see the harms of these kids who had been put on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. They started to see young people detransitioning in droves.
Yeah.
And the truth could no longer be ignored. What a tragedy.
Jen, I watched you go through so many of these eye-opening moments, and I can't help but want to ask, I know you're politically homeless. I know that you will never subscribe to an ideology on either political side. Neither will I, by the way. Like, I feel like politicians should earn our trust, not receive our trust, no matter what they have, a D or an R next to them. That is something for them to earn from us.
Yeah.
Curious. Now, I've seen you at some conservative events. People generally dehumanize Republicans. That has been my experience. I live in California, and oftentimes they don't talk about us conservatives as people. They talk about us as Republicans, as if we all believe in the same thing. We're intolerant. We're evil. We don't even get to speak. We're somewhat contagious, but I think our contagion is because we make sense, not because we have some sort of ideological leprosy.
Yeah.
How has that been for you when you come to these events with your own personal ideas and ideology about other things? We don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
Do you feel welcome? Do you feel judged? I personally want to make sure that you do realize that conservatives come with diversity of thought.
Yeah.
We don't focus so much on diversity of gender and genitalia and color of skin and all the things that the left says. But I'm curious, how has that experience been for you?
The experience has been, welcoming. I've been at events and on media, conservative media, for the last 2.5 years. I've felt very welcome. I make it very clear that I'm not a registered Republican. I'm an independent, and we probably disagree on some stuff. I don't care. There's a lot we agree on, and we can fight shoulder to shoulder on that. So by and large, I feel very welcome. Every once in a while, I have an experience, not really at an event, but possibly online, where, the farther reaches of the right will come for me. I'm not right enough. I'm not right enough. I'm not left enough. I'm nothing enough.
Is anybody anything enough? Anybody?
I just ignore it. I just ignore it. But I will tell you, for instance, we saw each other at Moms for Liberty, and there's a bunch of people that follow me online or read my Substack who became familiar with me during COVID. They're moms like myself, maybe disaffected liberals, and the mainstream media is very convincing in saying that Moms for Liberty is a hate group. Like, I got a private message recently, someone who said, "I really support everything you do, and say I'm disappointed you would go to Moms for Liberty. It's a hate group."
Yeah.
And this is a person who's very open-minded. She pushed back on COVID restrictions, and I just encouraged her to not trust the headlines in the New York Times. I know Tiffany Justice, who's one of the founders of Moms for Liberty. I've known her before she founded it. Do we agree on everything? No. Have we been willing to support each other and stand side by side in pushing back on COVID restrictions for our kids? Yes. That's all that matters. She's not a terrorist. It's ridiculous on its face, but it's very convincing. Even for skeptics, it's convincing.
Right. I think that what people need to learn is that when they're only seeing ad hominem attacks, right? If I'm being called an anti-Semite, or if Tiffany Justice is being called a terrorist and it's just an ad hominem attack and they can't actually get to the core of the issue of what we're advocating for, that should be the light bulb. When you were called all kinds of names, but you are not actually being confronted with the ideas of what you were advocating for, that was when people should have realized that lies are coming their way. And I hope that this, again, is another one of those great awakenings for people in the United States and around the world, that you're being lied to by the media. And it's time to open up your eyes. And once you see the lies, I don't think you can unsee them anymore in the way that it has happened to you. Let me end with this.
Yeah.
Thank you for what you're doing. For those who don't want to go to sleep tonight feeling like they haven't done enough, the very, very least they can do is buy a T-shirt and to drag a friend to wear that T-shirt with them so that they won't have to look back in 20 years from now and talk to their friends and grandparents and people around them and say they have done nothing. At the very least, they stood up for these young women. And I think that is a very good step, because people ask all the time what they can do. Buying a T-shirt should be a simple enough thing to do. Where can they go to get it?
Yeah, it should be the least you can do. If you go to thetruthfits.com, that's our website. That's like a little vanity URL, just so you can remember it. I will say this, I'm not playing here. Like, this is amazing product. So this is not a gimmick. These are high quality sweats, T-shirts, and performance product. You don't have to sacrifice to wear our leggings to work out in.
And you're not making them in China either.
We do not make anything in China. We do produce a lot of product outside of the country, but we make nothing in China. We have clear visibility into the factories. We know what the working conditions are. That's very important to me. Like I said, I learned from the best at Levi's in this regard, and they really are ahead of the curve, I would say, Levi's is, in terms of not just the quality, but in driving for safe working conditions for workers. So you don't have to sacrifice. Don't buy from brands that hate you.
Well,
why would you do it? Why would you do it? Especially if you can get great products. So we have that. I hope people will check it out. And it is the least you can do. Wear a T-shirt.
Yeah, let's unite behind our kids. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.